Russo Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, the first modern conflict where an Asian country defeated an European power, often framed as a war between equals. In fact, it was an imperial war for dominions over colonial lands, primarily Manchuria in northeast China. In the Korean peninsula, Russia and Japan both were colonizing powers, while Korean and Chinese people experienced war as a foreign and new type of domination. The Russian Empire, late in the 19th century, for example, had long wanted to head to the Pacific to obtain warm water, ports, and new trade routes. With the opening of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the lease over the Liaodong Peninsula and the port of Arthur, Russia established itself in Manchuria, pushing aside other empires and bringing enormous pressure to bear on Korea. Japan had in fact swiftly modernized after the Meiji Restoration and viewed territorial expansion as a marker of civilization, as well as security necessity. Following the defeat of China in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895, Japan viewed Korea as its natural sphere of influence, but the intervention of European powers like Russia turned it into a passive spender and drove deep restatement. By 1903, the imperial rivalry between the two had focused on two areas, Manchuria and Korea. In recent years, such studies indicate that Japan seen Russian troops as a potential threat to its future economically and military, whereas Russia had a limited grasp of Japan's capabilities and relied on its numerical and territorial superiority to dominate over Japan. Ex-imperialist rivalry, diplomatic commitment problems, and fear of unfavorable equilibrium of power contribute to the outbreak of war. Above all, the Russo-Japanese War was a war that took place on foreign soil. Chinese and Korean lands became battlefields. I mean occupational population displacement and compelled labor, which caused local populations to suffer. In Korea, Japan had imposed unequal treaties before the war, and after the war, the country went from being a protectorate to having virtually no diplomatic capacity. The new treaty, signed in 1905 after the Russian defeat under increased Japanese pressure, made Korea into a protectorate and paved the road to formal annexion in 1910. For many Koreans, the Japanese victory didn't translate into liberation. It meant that one potential colonizer was displaced by another that was nearer and more aggressive. On Manchuria, Russia and Japan were colonial powers. They controlled railways, lines, strategic ports, and natural resources, while the Chinese government was only weakened and humiliated by yet another war fought on its territory. Presence of military forces, trench warfare, and sieges such as the one of Port Arthur brought both destruction and humanitarian crises to local inhabitants. The violence was both physical and symbolic. It cemented racial discourses and created stratifications in culture. Japan's success was seen as a reversal of the racial order for the Asian and for the European, and that victory justified Japan's own imperial projects and its perceived superiority over all other Asian peoples. In Russia, the battle ultimately brought with its own dramatic social disasters and, in part, fueled the Russian Revolution of 1905, challenging Tsarism and underscoring international imperialism expense to the Russian people. In Japan, the triumph augmented the national glorification of the government and the military, and it affirmed that the nation had to adapt for a gain precedent like that of all major European colonizers. Japan then conquered Korea, Taiwan, and parts of Manchuria in the ensuing decades, using its cultural assimilation, economic exploitation, and political repression policy. Korea had just entered a direct colonization period after the defeat of the Russians. There were also resistance bands like the 1905 uprising and later the March 1st movement in 1919, which spoke vigorously from a desire to stand up against Japanese occupation of the country. The experiences of colonial violence during and after the Russo Japanese War drove these nationalism struggles. We should therefore critically reflect on the colonial past of nations for a number of reasons. It enabled us to disrupt heroic reductive narratives. The Russo-Japanese War is often hailed as the emancipation of Asia from Europe, but listening to the Korean and Chinese stories revealed that the war was also meant new forms of subjugation, exploitation, and violence. Recognizing this complexity keeps us from replacing an imperial myth with another. In conclusion, the Russo-Japanese War, more than just another confrontation between two emerging superpowers, it was an episode in the history of global imperialism, where Russia, for example, sought to possess lands and peoples that were not completely its own. Reading it through the lens both colonizers and colonized give us a sense of how power hierarchies were created for East Asia. Their consequences, like political, economic, and symbolic, and continuing implications to represent today. The condemnation of colonial history goes beyond guilt, but rather responds to historical responsibility. Only if we acknowledge the violence and resistance which helped fashion in colonial past can we begin to envision a more just international order today.